The gravity of the time is such that every new avenue of peace, no matter how dimly discernible, should be explored. Never before in history has so much hope for so many people been gathered together in a single organization. You will provide a great share of the wisdom, of the courage, and the faith which can bring to this world lasting peace for all nations and happiness and well-being for all men.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of your favorite nuclear energy podcast, Titans of Nuclear. My name is Phoebe Lind. I am here with our esteemed guest today, Karl Hausker. He is a senior fellow of the climate program at World Resources Institute, and we're thrilled to have him on today. We do want to note before we jump into our interview that Karl's interview today will reference slides that are linked in the show notes. So if listeners want to follow along, you may do that by clicking the link in the show notes. At times, Karl might mention specific graphs or specific charts that might provide additional insight into the research that we'll be discussing today. So we do recommend checking those out. If not, we'll make sure to describe whatever it is we're talking about along the way, so you'll be able to keep up. Karl, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much, Phoebe.
Would you mind kicking us off with providing a brief overview of who you are, what you do, what brings you to Titans of Nuclear?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I've been working on climate change for 30 plus years from various positions on Capitol Hill with the Senate Energy Committee, working for EPA under President Clinton, and at consulting firms and research institutes like the World Resources Institute. So have quite a history and have followed the IPCC reports carefully over those years. That's the key topic we're going to talk about today. And I have a real passion for this issue because it really is the mother of all environmental problems. And we have a lot of work ahead of us.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree with that. So today you are an expert reviewer for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, as we call it. Would you mind providing a little bit of a background on what the IPCC is, what the reports are, and what inspired you to get into this work?
Mm-hmm. Yes, thanks. The IPCC is a UN body that serves the Framework Convention on Climate Change and conducts periodic assessments of the science, the impacts of climate change, and mitigation strategies to preserve a safe climate. It conducts assessment reports every roughly 8 years or so, and this year it completed the 6th assessment report. It is a gargantuan multi-year effort. It is largely done by volunteer scientists and other experts with a small central staff at the IPCC. It synthesizes and summarizes the body of work. So the IPCC actually doesn't conduct original research itself, but conducts a massive literature survey and synthesis, again, over those 3 basic topics: science, impacts, and mitigation. And as you said, I was honored to serve as an expert reviewer on the mitigation report and on the synthesis report. And I could explain a little bit more the different pieces of an assessment report, if you like.
Sure, we can definitely get into that. I think for some context for our listeners as well, a lot of folks might have heard of the IPCC and these assessment reports, especially the 6th assessment report. It seems that they get more and more drastic every iteration that comes out, but that is the reality that we're dealing with. As a lot of folks might be aware, a very widely adopted climate goal that we now have is to keep global average temperatures from rising from either 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius, because those are 2 very critical points at which, irreparable damage occurs to Earth's natural and human systems. So just for context, people might have heard about it like in the news and other reports. Again, this gargantuan report, as you put it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So each assessment report consists of 3 work group reports, as I said, science, impacts, and then mitigation strategies. And then at the very end of the process, there is a synthesis report that attempts to tie all 3 together. So each work group report is typically 2,000 to 3,000 pages long. And each of them contains a summary for policymakers. I'll use that acronym SPM frequently here, summary for policymakers. You can think of it actually as an IPCC report as a 3-layer cake, 2,000 to 3,000 pages of incredible in-depth review. And then there's typically a technical summary written by the scientists and other experts for each, which is typically maybe 100 or so pages. And then an SPM summary for policymakers of 30 to 50 pages. And then a synthesis report, this last one released in March of this year, tries to pull it all together in about 80 to 100 pages. You can imagine that writing a SPM or a synthesis report is extremely difficult to try to boil down the essence of all those. But these are really important because often they're the only document that a policymaker or a stakeholder or a journalist would read. So it's important that they're accurate in terms of summarizing the findings. The other thing that makes it particularly difficult is that an SPM and the synthesis report is actually finally edited, added, subtracted to by 192 nations who are part of the FCCC and the IPCC. So there is some, ultimately they become political documents because of that, the government representatives sitting down and writing that. So over the years, one can occasionally find a divergence of what an SPM says from the underlying report. And that happened, unfortunately, this time too. So, like I say, and this is why I'm offering you and other audiences a deep dive, because in my experience as an expert reviewer, I found some significant divergences of the SPM from the underlying report on mitigation strategies.
How many people do you think actually get to that full report, like that bottom layer of the tiered cake, as you mentioned?
That is a very good question. I don't have a good feel for that, other than to say it's probably a pretty small number. The expert reviewers, such as myself, and then probably a series of researchers who will go into particular pieces of it to figure out what the IPC said in detail about a certain topic.
So you're responsible for a very small section then of that report, or did you review how much of the report were you an expert reviewer on?
Right. I zeroed in on the areas of sort of greatest interest and where I brought expertise, which is on the energy systems in general, and particularly the electricity system. I also have pretty good background in transportation. Other parts of the mitigation strategy, the mitigation report that dealt with non-CO2 gases, I don't bring much expertise there, or to land use and the sequestration of carbon in forests and soils. I sort of skimmed through those sections, but didn't have a lot of comments, again, because I did not feel I had a lot of expertise there.
And this research that you're presenting today, is this research that you also presented to the IPCC as a part of your expert review? Or is this research kind of a separate venture of yours?
It's a separate venture. In my role as reviewer, I submitted comments on 2 drafts of the documents, the mitigation report and then the synthesis report. As it went in then to final government review, they sit down for 2 weeks, nations around a table, and then they finalize it. And when I looked at the final versions compared to some of the earlier drafts and compared the SPM to the full report, I collected these observations and reflections on these divergences, and they particularly have an impact on how the role of nuclear generation is portrayed in the mitigation strategies, and hence that has led me to various audiences like you and the Titans of Nuclear.
Okay, so our understanding now, we have a very large report. It gets boiled down to a very small report, and then almost 200 countries with very different goals and very different agendas have to agree on what goes into that report.
And that
report is the one that policymakers all around the world who may or may not have had influence on that report, that's what they read, and that's what directly affects the decisions that they make on climate action.
Right.
So what did the IPCC find regarding, the emission pathways that we need to get to limit climate change?
Yeah. Let me make one more preface comment as I go into and answer your question to help listeners and readers. The IPCC examined somewhat over 500 studies and modeling exercises in the literature that could keep warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees. And within those 500 and in some of the data I'm going to describe, they take sort of a statistical approach to the results of those 500 studies. They all have a forecast of what temperature a certain pathway for the global economy would achieve. They have certain levels of, say, solar deployment or carbon capture, certain levels of methane gas release, certain levels of nuclear deployment. And what I'll refer to is sometimes they will talk about a median value for one of those indicators. What does this scenario look like? And they often also give what's called the interquartile range of that indicator, from a 25th percentile to a 75th percentile. And so I'll be talking a little bit in those terms of median values for some of these scenarios, interquartile ranges. So with that underway, we can jump into discussing what do these mitigation strategies look like that could keep us in the 1.5 or 2 degree range. And I'm going to refer to the first slide that you're going to post here, which is called Emissions Scenarios and Illustrative Mitigation Pathways. And this is from the SPM figure 5A and 5B. Some of you have probably seen the kind of steep trajectories we need to get on for both the aggregate of all global greenhouse gases as well as CO2 in particular. The IPCC modeling in these 500 scenarios indicate that we will have to reduce our net global GHG emissions to approximately zero by mid to late in this century, typically by the 2070s, 2080s. And on the graph, you'll see the sort of band of purple and bluish striped envelope that contains all those 500 scenarios. And within them, the IPCC has called out what they call illustrative mitigation pathways. You'll see like a solid line and a dotted line charting a particular scenario for the decrease in those gases. When you look at CO2 emissions, which is the right-hand side of the graph I was just referring to, you'll see that the decrease we need in CO2 emissions is even steeper than overall greenhouse gases. And that's because, number one, the reductions of CO2 emissions tend to be easier than reducing a lot of the methane emissions, nitrous oxide emissions, and other trace industrial gases. But also, it's hard to take those non-CO2 gases all the way to zero. We don't know how to do it. But we know ways in which we can reduce our CO2 emissions all the way to zero, or even go to a negative net CO2 emission pathway by taking CO2 out of the atmosphere by biological means, forests and increased storage in soils, and increasingly developing ways, technological ways, to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere, such as direct air capture and storage, bioenergy combustion with carbon capture, enhanced mineralization, and other things underway. So you'll see on the right-hand side of that graph that by mid-century, we need to take CO2 emissions all the way to zero and then begin to go into a net negative CO2 mode later in the century to offset the non-CO2 gases, because you can't take them to zero. We also need to go heavy negative if we overshoot a temperature goal and need to pull CO2 back out of the atmosphere. So this is the first way in which the SPM depicts what do we need to do. It's the total emissions of gases. And then we can turn next to, well, how the heck do you get there? What needs to happen to get to a net zero CO2 emission system or even negative? And the SPM is very clear and in describing qualitatively how we do this. Number one, we need to increase energy efficiency and conservation, take our energy needs down as low as possible. Then we need to move to a pure zero carbon electricity generation system across the globe. We need to produce huge amounts of zero carbon electricity. And the good news is we actually have lots of ways to do that. We have solar, we have wind, geothermal, hydro, nuclear, and increasingly we can burn fossil fuels with nearly 100% capture of the CO2 emissions. And I particularly encourage people to look into what's called the Alum Cycle, which is very promising on that front.
Is that actually used very often where people are fossil? Could you explain a little bit more about how that might have been implemented already? I think a lot of people are familiar with, why solar, wind, why that's zero emissions. How do you get fossil fuels to be zero emissions?
Yeah. The first some of the early demonstrations of carbon capture on an industrial plant or electric power plant have shown ranges of capture from 60 to 80 to 90, maybe up to 95%. And that's all good for really decreasing the emissions from those sources. There's a particular technology called the Alum Cycle, which is now in its first prototypes, beginning to move to full commercial deployment. And what this does is instead of having an end of the pipe capture of CO2 and separating it from the other exhaust elements, on the front end, it separates air into nitrogen and oxygen and then burns, say, natural gas in a pure stream of oxygen. So on the other end, you have like a pure CO2 stream that you can immediately concentrate, compress, and pump underground. So companies developing this can get close to 100% capture. Very promising. One of the many technologies we should be developing to make sure we have a broad portfolio to attack this problem.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I hadn't heard of that technology before. I can be a little bit skeptical of, fossil fuel interests. I am very passionate about nuclear energy. I also think there's a place for renewables in a lot of this case. But aside from implementing kind of all of these carbon reducing technologies, do you think reducing carbon dioxide and all of these other greenhouse gases on such a steep level is achievable? Like, how do we even start going about that?
It is a daunting task, but we have many of the technologies already developed. We have a lot of things ready to move into commercial scale. We need to have some breakthroughs, I think, in things like long duration electricity storage. We need to, fully commercialize a number of the very promising nuclear designs that you're aware of. And we also need to, I think, have some breakthroughs in ways to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere cheaply. Right now, they're quite expensive on the technological side. But let me just go back to the sort of those 6 key tasks in getting to that net zero CO2 energy system. I mentioned efficiency and conservation, producing tons of zero carbon electricity. And then what we do with that is we electrify as many end uses across the economy as possible. We electrify our space heating and our water heating in our buildings. We electrify transportation to the greatest extent possible, which we're in the process of with EVs. And then in industry, we can produce a lot of the heat needs of industry with electricity, but not all of them. And so that takes us to the fourth task, where we can't electrify an end use. There are many places where we can use a low carbon or a zero carbon fuel produced by electricity. We can produce hydrogen by electrolysis. And by mid-century, we will probably be producing a lot of our hydrogen with electrolysis. We'll also need some sustainable biofuels in some quantities, again, for those end uses that we can't electrify. Might be aviation, heavy industry, some heavy-duty transportation. The fifth strategy is then to minimize the use of those fossil fuels where we don't have, where we can't electrify them, deploy some carbon capture wherever it's feasible. And then finally, the sixth step is to use carbon dioxide removal technologies and practices to counterbalance whatever remaining emissions exist in the system, either from CO2, from burning fossil fuels, or to counterbalance those non-CO2 gases I mentioned. So if we take all these six steps, which we can envision, and that we have a lot of the technologies already, some we still need to develop things, zero carbon electricity becomes the main workhorse of the economy, replacing the combustion of fossil fuels, supplementing again with some bioenergy, some carbon capture. So in the briefest, way, that is what we need to do, and that's what the SPM of the mitigation report tells us to do. Here's where the SPM goes next on this, and this is so fascinating as I saw the final version. Mm-hmm. It gives us very detailed quantitative results on how fast coal and oil and gas need to decrease. For instance, to stay to 1.5 degrees, we would have to knock coal down about 95% by 2050, oil by 60%, natural gas by 45%. And the SPM gives us all this detail about the interquartile ranges, even tell us the 5th through 95th percentile ranges spelled out there. Actually, more data than you want in an SPM on the details of 1.5 and 2 degree scenarios. And that's all good. But from there, I sort of expected it to say, like, well, what fills the gap? What do we bring in as we're phasing down all the coal and oil and gas?
And some of my own personal interests here, that is like a lot of pushback. Like I think we need rapid climate action, and a lot of folks are really pushing for renewables. But the one problem that we have there is that there are certain cases where renewables will not fill all of those gaps. We love nuclear because it can provide that firm baseload power, but you're saying that the SPM, it doesn't provide any suggestions for how to fill that gap from reducing oil and carbon. What does it say instead?
The funny thing about it is that it doesn't clearly tell you what fills the gap. Instead, where the SPM goes next is a slide that your listeners can look at, called Sectoral Contributions to a Net Zero GHG. And what you'll see when you look at this, it's figure SPM 5F in the report, is it breaks down the percentage contribution of buildings, industry, transport to reducing emissions from current levels all the way down to zero. And then it gives you also what the enhanced forestry techniques, land use techniques, with that wonderful acronym of LULUCF, land use and land use change and forestry, and reduction of the non-CO2 gases. So you have a nice figure that says, okay, LULUCF and non-CO2 gases can contribute about 26% of getting all the way to zero. And buildings, industry, and transport can contribute about 74% of that needed GHG when you look at the median values of all these 500 scenarios. But you're left scratching your head saying, that's the energy system. That's the energy system that feeds buildings and industry and transport. So what's next? And what the SPM does, it throws a few more numbers out, quantitative results on methane reductions, percentage reductions, industry buildings, transportation, some practices, some cumulative gigatons of carbon dioxide removal needed, what demand side options can do. But the SPM doesn't describe either in figures or in text, what does the energy system look like in 2030? What does it look like in 2050? What happens to the total demand for primary energy? How successful is our efficiency and conservation strategies? What are the energy supplies that replace coal and oil and gas? To do that, you actually have to leave the SPM. You have to go to the full report. Fortunately, early in the full report, there is the technical summary document that has a key table. And this is the next slide that you'll see in the posting. Table TS2, the technical summary, gives all these really key global indicators on what needs to happen for 1.5 or 2 degree scenarios. Tells you for 2030 and 2050. And a lot of these numbers were pulled right into the SPM, but not the numbers on what sources replace oil and gas and coal. So this very detailed table, my next slide zooms in, and viewers will see how primary energy from coal decreases, how primary energy from oil decreases. And there's your 95% number, your 60% number, your 45% number for gas, and how it's slower in the 2 degree scenarios, faster in the 1.5 degree scenarios, faster for carbon intense fuel like coal, somewhat slower for the least carbon intensive fuel, natural gas. So like, oh, that's where these numbers came from. Great. But finally, when you scroll down, and the next slide I said, I have labels, which energy sources increase. Finally, here we get an idea. And starting at the bottom of these couple rows of tables, we see that renewables, what they call the non-biomass renewables, solar, wind, and hydro, they have to grow tremendously by 2050, over 700% beyond current levels to hit 1.5. And then the next series of rows for 2030, 2050 is modern biomass, the kind of dedicated crops and modern technologies to squeeze gaseous and liquid fuels out of biomass has to increase nearly 300% by 2050. And then finally, and of interest to your viewers, I'm sure, is the role of nuclear in these mitigation scenarios. By 2050, these mitigation scenarios indicate that in a median value, nuclear has to nearly double, an increase of 90% over current levels, with a large interquartile range from 15% all the way to nearly 300%. Again, big ranges on the hole that nuclear may need to fill as coal, oil, and gas are decreased. Also shows a 40% rise by 2030 on a median value basis. So this is finally getting us to understand what kind of changes in the energy system are needed that then feed that energy into buildings and transport and industry and elsewhere.
Just to emphasize just how dramatic of a change this would be, I think a lot of folks are aware, we need a lot more renewables, we need more nuclear. We're not going to, energy efficiency can only get us so far in reducing our energy demand, but there's still people all around the world in developing countries who, need more energy in order to advance. That said, this is requiring 725% increase in renewables to get to keep global warming from increasing 1.5 degrees Celsius. Right. But that is a massive change.
Yeah, that is a massive change. The scale up of whether it's renewables or biomass or nuclear, they're all challenging. They will all have certain technical obstacles. We'll see how the economics play out. And also there may be political obstacles to any of these, which again is why I think it's so important to have a portfolio ready, because we cannot predict how this is going to play out. We can't choose, oh, I like this scenario, so we will do that scenario. I think that's a completely misguided way to think about this.
Do you have any idea as to how these specific percentages came about? Why isn't nuclear 200% so that renewables only has to increase 500%, for instance?
Mhm.
Like, are those adjustable at all, those
Yeah.
specific percentages?
Yeah, individual scenarios will carry a range, and I'll actually use that question you just asked to turn to the electricity generation mix, which is, we just established electricity is absolutely key.
Mhm.
And the tables I just described talk about primary energy in exajoules across both electricity and other forms of energy. But now, pertinent to your question, when how you do an electricity generation mix that keeps the lights on, it's reliable and affordable and zero carbon, that is absolutely critical. And yet the SPM has no depiction of the electricity generation mix of the future. What you have to do is go way into chapter 6, into figure 6.30, to finally find a depiction of what these 500 scenarios look like in terms of the electricity generation mix. And so your viewers and listeners will see a slide on this that shows the role of solar and wind measured together. How much electricity do we get from that? How much from CCS applied to fossil systems as well as bioenergy? And finally, how much do we get from nuclear? This key figure in chapter 6 shows solar and wind, sort of the variable renewable sources, as currently at about a little less than 10% of global generation. And it shows on a median value it growing to 40, 50, perhaps 60% by 2050, staying in a range of about 55 to 70% in that interquartile range. And this is kind of a mainstream conclusion that the good news is the price of solar and wind has dropped a lot. Many people expect it could become a mainstay of the power system, but it needs to be complemented by clean, firm sources. So the other two parts of this figure show CCS in the middle, almost at 0% of current generation mix, but growing to be maybe 5 or 10% of total generation by 2050, gradually building, but with huge ranges, maybe from 5% to 25%. And then finally, the right-hand side of this figure shows the role of nuclear generation. It's currently already supplying 10% of the world's total electricity on a firm zero carbon basis. And the 500 scenarios show it either hovering at about 10% into the future or growing maybe to as much as 20% or more. And it's kind of interesting.
Just to comment on some of these graphs as we're looking at them, some of them appear that like the ranges even drop it down to below 5%.
Yes, some people run models, and depending on what they assume about either political constraints on nuclear or cost assumptions, or how much they assume renewables will continue to drop and maybe battery storage comes in, you can have a scenario where as a percentage nuclear may drop. However, what's really important to think about is going back to the 6 tasks for zero carbon system. Electricity production has to soar. And for a 1.5 degree world or 2.0 world, we need to at least double total electricity generation by 2050. Some scenarios have it going even higher, maybe tripling. So even if nuclear generation were to keep a 10% share on a percentage basis, it has to double by 2050 to maintain that role. So when you look at figure 6.30 as a whole, what you see is sort of a support for a mainstream conclusion. Solar and wind can grow a lot, but they need to be complemented by nuclear and CCS as clean, firm sources that keep the lights on either both a daily basis and a seasonal basis when the solar and wind production goes down, or cover for what my favorite word in this field is the Dunkelflaute, the dark doldrums. The Germans, of course, they invent long nouns for everything. And every winter, there's a period of very low solar and wind output, can last 7, 10, 14 more days, when Germany has to turn to something else during the Dunkelflaute. So this is a reason why it's very hard to envision a 100% renewable system driven by solar and wind. You do need to complement it with clean firm. And that's another major theme that doesn't appear in the SPM, but does appear in Chapter 6 here.
So do you have any idea what Germany will be doing now that they just took a bunch of nuclear offline, but they're still going to have the Dunkelflaute? Did I say that right?
Yeah, the Dunkelflaute. Yeah, right now they turn on their coal and their gas plants when the Dunkelflaute comes. Increasingly, they will say, okay, we're going to have green hydrogen in the future to back this up. We'll have more transmission ties to other areas, etc. But it's a daunting task.
Yeah, in 2023, we still don't have all of those sources to fulfill that yet.
Yeah.
Unless, if only there was nuclear. Who would have thought?
So I want to come to a final, or actually, yeah, let me come to a final point about the SPM that I find really troubling. What I've described so far is, as you've heard, is how the SPM doesn't really specify much about what replaces coal and oil and gas. It talks about sectoral changes. I've documented through these two figures how that nuclear continues to play a key role in nearly all of the mitigation scenarios. But what happened is, in the final editing of the SPM by the governments around a table, is they kind of erased nearly every reference to nuclear. So what you'll find if you read the full report in the technical summary and deep in chapters 3 and chapter 6 is that nuclear appears on a short list of 3 or 4 low or no carbon technologies. And I'll post a slide here that zeroes right in on this, that says, nearly all electricity will come from sources like nuclear, biomass, non-biomass renewables, and fossil fuels with CCS. Those are like the 4 sources that continually appear through the full report. But when you get to the SPM and you look for the parallel language, it says almost all electricity is supplied from zero low carbon sources, such as renewables or fossil fuels with CCS. So suddenly the list of 4 gets down to 2. They pull it out. Nuclear makes a little cameo appearance in kind of a long laundry list of options in figure SPM 7, which I'm also happy to post. And there's one other, if you do a word search for it, it appears one other time. It's sort of a negative reference where the SPM says nuclear has a high upfront cost. That's why it's not deploying or growing very fast. So it's
in
a
this
puzzle.
summary document, the word nuclear only appears twice?
Like, twice.
Twice.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah. So given the substantial role nuclear plays in the mitigation scenarios, why is it barely mentioned? And you can even go back to the 2018 special 1.5 degrees report. The SPM mentions nuclear explicitly, says it plays a role. You can go back to the last assessment report, 5th assessment report in 2014, and in the SPM, you will see explicit mention that nuclear is one of these low carbon, zero carbon technologies that plays a role. So in contrast, what happened here? The best I can discern from talks with people involved and also some journalistic coverage of those negotiations is that some countries objected to nuclear being talked about explicitly in the SPM. And I find that unfortunate, and I find it kind of disturbing because that omission, in my view, kind of distorts the message of the full Workgroup 3 report.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's intriguing as well, just because from a young person's perspective, I feel like nuclear energy has gotten more popular in recent years as people realize how critical it is to decarbonize and the fact that we're going to need a lot of different technologies at play. And just not only that nuclear plays a role, but that it will need to play a critical role in order to provide, this gap in energy as we reduce our emissions from reducing our use of oil and gas. So you said it's a couple of countries. What other kind of factors might influence the decision to, keep nuclear out of this most recent SPM when it was included just a few years ago?
Yeah. I don't know for a fact. I can only speculate because it's not,
Of
no
course.
one has spelled it out. But I think the intense opposition of a handful of countries to nuclear power carried the day in these back and forth negotiations, and sort of the flavor and the spin that governments wanted to put on the SPM. But I also want to react to what you just said about increasing support for nuclear power in recent years. I think that's a very good, accurate observation. I have observed among sort of in the U.S. among environmental groups in general, several have moved toward being less opposed and even positively supportive of nuclear power as they see the slow progress toward reducing and slowing the growth of emissions. They are sort of re-examining how important nuclear is in to solve this problem. And I think we also saw a significant impact from the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where a number of countries realized that they need to pay more attention to energy security as well
Absolutely.
as climate change. And those two together have spurred a number of countries to begin making plans for further expansion of nuclear in the wake of that invasion. The final thing I might note is that when you look at the long-term strategies that countries submit to the Framework Convention on Climate Change, you'll find that a lot of countries do have maintenance and expansion of nuclear power in their long-term strategies out to 2050. And you look at the number of G7 countries that do that, the biggest economies in the world. You look at the G20 countries, the 20 biggest economies of the world, are responsible for the lion's share of emissions. You will see nuclear in their plans. And so this is also a very important sign that this is where governments and the private sector are heading. And I think it's kind of putting one's head in the sand to say that there's no role for nuclear in solving climate change.
Well, it doesn't say that there's no role, it just omits it from this report, right? But it's not necessarily antagonistic.
Right. Yeah. To put a fine point on it, yes. That what happens in the SPM of Work Group 3 is an omission, not saying nuclear is not part of the problem.
Yeah.
That omission, in my mind, carries a risk of policymakers, stakeholders, journalists not understanding that it is part of the mix. And that also just prompted me to remember the final footnote on this. I've been talking about the SPM of Work Group 3 on mitigation. I also mentioned at the outset that there is a synthesis report that came out, again, March 2023, that tries to tie together and summarize the science, the impacts, and the mitigation strategies. And I'm sad to report that the synthesis report carried the same omissions as the Work Group 3 SPM. You will find virtually no reference to nuclear in the synthesis report either.
That's fascinating to just think about, especially because it's supposed to reflect, the science. It should be objective. And does that go through the same procedure that the SPM does, where
Correct.
all member nations need to agree on that
then? The nations have to edit and sign off on the final synthesis report.
So what other checks and balances exist here that might, try to correct that problem? It still seems shocking to me that maybe only a small handful of countries would object to nuclear, but they couldn't be, there's nobody else who are in that group that's saying no, this is absolutely necessary to include.
Yeah.
Is there anybody there who does exist and then they just failed at their job this time?
I don't have a clear window into what happened. Again, I have secondhand accounts, but each government has probably a sort of priority list of things that they want to stay in, that must stay in, or it must come out, given their views on this. And there were not enough countries championing the inclusion of nuclear as it had been in previous IPCC reports. Hence, it fell out. This dynamic plays out even in things like science and impacts, and how just when scientists tried to write, the history of GHG emissions, well, particularly developing countries will want an emphasis on how the industrialized countries are more responsible for the historic emissions. So that's kind of that's a flavor of what otherwise would be scientific language.
At this point, it's almost more like it's just a result of who has the best negotiation tactics at these conversations rather than what science says we actually need in order to solve climate change.
I think it comes out as a strange mixture of those. But I want to emphasize that also that the full report and the technical summary, particularly, which I would direct a lot of people to, it's only 100 pages. It's not 2,000 pages. That is not influenced by political forces, and the authors, the scientists, and other experts do a fantastic job on synthesizing the body of knowledge, the body of literature out there, and I really think they did a fantastic job on that. It's just when we come to trying to summarize it with government representatives bargaining around a table, we start to lose important information, important findings.
That it's sad to say, but it makes sense, because a lot of times you see this case also when you're translating, scientific reports to what you're seeing in the news as well. You lose a lot of the nuance. You might have a story that's a little more sensationalized, and that's how it's communicated to the general public or to policymakers in this instance. So in a few words, what do you think we can do to solve this problem of of misinformation almost? People aren't getting all the info they need from the SPM. So pointing people to the technical report, that's one way. And that's kind of your campaign now, yes?
That's a role I'm taking on to try to make sure people understand what is missing from the SPM. And what we can do is the slides that you're going to post that I've shared with a variety of organizations and stakeholders and briefing governments where able. It provides easy windows into the technical summary, into chapter 3, into chapter 6 to find, what is the role of CCS, what is the role of nuclear, what happens to primary energy demand. I'll put one more spin that I didn't cover on this, but some of the scenarios have primary energy demand dropping so fast by 2030 that it just strains credibility. We want all these demand side strategies to succeed, but again, if you sort of start to put your eggs in that basket of massive decreases just 7 years from now, it's probably not going to play out. You better have a backup plan. And I think it's also incumbent on people as there will be more IPCC reports. They're already starting to plan the 7th assessment. People should, I think, should ask for more transparency, more clarity from governments to say, if you object to something, maybe that can be noted in an SPM, but to pull stuff completely out, that's an important finding. That borders on distortion. I make a comparison. Okay.
Yeah, I'm thinking about what that might look like where it's more transparent, but can you imagine in a future version of this report where they're saying there's a little asterisk at the bottom saying this particular energy source was not included because this country and this country did not want it to be included. Yeah. That would absolutely transform that process.
Yeah. Let me give an example of that could be perhaps modeled somewhat by the IPCC. There was recently a G7 communique from the G7 nations on a variety of topics, but including climate and energy, and it had a section on nuclear. And one of the first sentences of that section of the communique sort of said, for those nations who are going to deploy nuclear, ba-boom, 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 that had a number of consensus points, not among the full G7, but among those that are deploying nuclear. And so I think you could say something parallel in IPCC reports when you come to the SPM. If there are some topics that some distant governments want to distance themselves from, there's language that you could adopt, because it goes throughout the mitigation strategies. Aggregate a whole bunch of data and indicators across the globe, but regions and countries are going to be different. Some countries don't have hydro, so they're not deploying hydro. Some countries will not have access to rich sources of bioenergy. Some will choose not to deploy nuclear. So we don't have to, it's not like an IPCC report is saying each country must do this. We know that the energy mix is going to vary by country, but let's not bury findings that are important from a global perspective because one country doesn't like that energy source.
It's interesting to think about. Yeah. Thank you so much for providing this insight. It's definitely, I don't think a lot of people actually kind of understand the thought process and the decision making that goes into these reports, how this information is synthesized and how that's communicated to people. Do you have any kind of final thoughts on this issue? Like what do you want people to walk away with this information now?
Yeah. I guess I would sum up, sort of reiterate my portfolio point on how we need lots of options because we're not sure how far we can go with any particular option. There are some activists in the climate community who care deeply about climate change, as I do, that see the risks of nuclear power as too great, so we shouldn't use it. We should phase it out as quickly as possible. Some also believe we should not deploy carbon capture, either as a way to reduce emissions or deploy carbon capture to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. They make arguments about moral hazard. If we do that, it will just be an excuse to keep burning fossil fuels. On that latter argument, I don't think human beings will be stupid enough to just keep burning fossil fuels if we commercialize carbon capture. So the moral hazard argument, I don't believe should stop us from developing that tool in the toolbox. A lot of people who care deeply about climate change understand that we are going to need all the tools in the toolbox and that we need to deploy what's already commercial very quickly and bring other technologies forward. And we can't just choose a single pathway. We need to see how the technologies develop, how the economics develop, and then ultimately how political opposition or embracing technologies moves things forward. I can spin a scenario of, if there's another major nuclear accident somewhere in the world, is that going to set us back on deploying nuclear? Could be. We're seeing a lot of opposition in the U.S. on the East Coast to offshore wind. I think that's misplaced. I think we should develop it personally, but citizens are lining up in many places to block that. How much can we achieve through changes in diet and conservation? There's a lot in the IPCC report about how we can, if many people shifted to a plant-based diet, agricultural emissions would go way down and people would be healthier. One can say, that strategy could succeed, but how many eggs can we put in that basket? How many major diet changes will take place over the next 30 years? All these are unknowns. Therefore, I think there's a strong argument to make for developing the full portfolio of options. And we have so much to do in such a short period of time. I don't think we can throw any tool out of the toolbox right now.
Yeah. If anything, we need to be inclusive rather than exclusive of any possible solution. That said, we got to move fast for sure. We've got 7 years till 2030 already before, we're only a few decades off from 2050 as well. But This has been very insightful. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast and shedding a little bit of light on this. It was wonderful to have you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Phoebe, for this opportunity. And thanks for everything you and your colleagues do.
Of course. And as a reminder to our listeners, those slides for more information on those charts, those graphs, those will be available in the show notes. Please check those out, and we'll see you on the next podcast.
And initiate at least a new approach to the many difficult problems that must be solved in both private and public conversation if the world is to shake off the inertia imposed by fear and is to make positive progress toward peace.